All right, so you guys really threw us a curveball this time with this one.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, a real head scratcher. So, you sent in this academic paper.
Okay.
It's by David MacArthur, and it's called, get this, A Vision of Blindness, Blade Runner and Moral Redemption.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Now, I don't know about you, but when I hear Blade Runner, my mind goes straight to like, classic sci-fi.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
That whole film noir vibe, all the rain, the neon lights, Harrison Ford looking all moody. But this paper this paper really wants us to dig a little deeper. It's making a case for something way more profound, like Blade Runner as this like deeply philosophical, even kind of religious experience.
Right, exactly. MacArthur, he's sort of suggesting that, we've been kind of fixated on that surface level question.
Yeah.
What does it mean to be human?
Yeah.
Especially with those replicants, right? Like, they look and act so human, it's hard to tell the difference.
Right.
But MacArthur, he's saying, hold on, there's something else going on here, something deeper. He's arguing that, really, Blade Runner is all about these big moral questions, even religious questions, like, can we actually overcome our own, kind of like inbuilt capacity for cruelty, for moral blindness, as he calls it.
Yeah. Okay. So this moral blindness thing, that's a pretty loaded term. We're going to have to unpack that a bit.
Yeah, definitely.
But before we get into all that, I got to get this out of the way. When you talk about Blade Runner, you've got to talk about all the different versions, right?
Right.
You've got the original theatrical cut from '82, then the director's cut in '92, and then, of course, you've got the final cut in 2007. So for this deep dive, for our purposes, which one are we looking at?
So MacArthur's mostly working with the director's cut for this. He says his interpretation holds up across all the later edits, but the director's cut is particularly interesting. I mean, that's where they added the whole unicorn sequence,
I know, right, yeah.
Plus, they got rid of that voiceover narration that a lot of people found a little too, on the nose. They also restored some of the more intense scenes, some of the violence that was originally cut out.
Right, yeah, no more happy ending either, right?
Exactly. Yeah, they got rid of that studio-imposed happy ending. So, yeah, definitely the director's cut for this one.
I'm with you on that. That voiceover always felt a bit clunky to me. But anyway, let's get back to the movie itself. I mean, I think the way most people approach Blade Runner, at least initially, is through this idea of blurred lines, between humans and replicants.
Yeah, definitely.
We're constantly asking ourselves who's who,
Mhm.
especially with Deckard, the main character. And those replicants, they seem to have emotions, empathy even, which just makes things, even more confusing. Would you say that's kind of the basic understanding of the film, like where most people start?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It's all about that ambiguity. MacArthur even mentioned Stephen Mulhall. He's a philosopher who's written a lot about Blade Runner. And Mulhall argues that the film is, and I'm quoting here, explicitly concerned with the question of what it is to be human. So, yeah, a lot of the debate around Blade Runner has been about that, about trying to figure out what makes someone truly human. And then, of course, the question becomes, well, does Deckard even fit that definition?
Okay, so that's the dominant interpretation. We've got this human-replicant divide, and we're all trying to figure out where the line is. But MacArthur, he's coming in and basically saying, not so fast.
Exactly.
So what's the main tension he wants us to think about instead? What's his counter-argument?
So he's saying that while, yeah, there's this whole thing about humans and replicants, that's not really the core of the film.
Yeah.
He argues that Blade Runner is operating on this much deeper level, more fundamental level. He says it's not just about defining what humanity is, but about whether we as humans can actually escape our own potential for darkness, for inhumanity.
Okay, that's a pretty big shift in perspective. So before we get into his interpretation, let's break down what he calls the first pass reading of the film. What's the typical way someone might understand Blade Runner when they first see it?
All right, so basically the first pass reading sees it as a straight-up detective story set in this dark, dystopian future. Los Angeles in 2019, all rainy and neon-drenched.
Right. Yeah.
And we've got Deckard. He's a retired Blade Runner, which basically means he was a cop who hunted down and retired. And by retired, I mean killed escaped replicants.
Ah.
And these aren't just any replicants. These are the advanced Nexus 6 models.
The top-of-the-line replicants.
Exactly.
Okay, so in this initial reading, the big assumption is that empathy is the key difference between humans and replicants, right? And that's where that whole Voight-Kampff test comes in.
Yeah, the Voight-Kampff test, yeah.
So can you remind us how that test works? Like, what exactly is it measuring?
Sure. So the test measures involuntary physiological responses, like, Changes in breathing, pupil dilation, blushing, that kind of stuff.
Mm.
Basically things you can't consciously control. And they use these pretty disturbing questions to provoke those responses.
Yeah, I remember those questions. Stuff about like torturing animals. Pretty intense stuff.
Yeah, exactly. It's designed to trigger an emotional response, especially relating to empathy.
Right. So the idea is if you don't have empathy, if you're a replicant, you won't react the same way a human would.
Exactly. And then as Deckard goes about his work, especially his interactions with Rachel, the replicant who doesn't even realize she's a replicant,
Right, right.
he starts to develop these feelings for her, empathy maybe.
Mm.
And the possibility that he himself might be a replicant makes us, the audience, question our own humanity. Like, what does it even mean to be human?
Right. And that whole thing about mortality, like, are we just machines in the end, too? Pretty heavy stuff.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, so that's the first pass reading. But MacArthur, he comes along and says, this interpretation, it just doesn't cut it.
Yeah, he calls it, get this, he calls it underwhelming.
Underwhelming.
Yeah, underwhelming. He says that focusing on just the human versus replicant thing, it doesn't do the film justice. It doesn't account for its impact, its mythic quality, and especially that ending, that really ambiguous ending. For a film that's become so iconic, he says, that interpretation just feels too, I don't know, too simplistic.
Okay, so let's get into it. What's MacArthur's take? What are these moral and religious themes he sees as central to Blade Runner?
All right, so here's the thing. MacArthur's main claim is that Blade Runner is, at its core, about morality and religion. He's not saying it's not about humanity, but he's saying it's not just about defining what humanity is. It's about humanity's capacity for redemption. Can we overcome our own, what he calls, moral blindness?
Okay, so that term moral blindness, what does he mean by that exactly? What are we talking about here?
So he lays out three main points that his interpretation is based on. Firstly, he says that replicants are, for all intents and purposes, human. Morally speaking, they're basically human. So he says getting hung up on biology or how they were created, that's a distraction from the real moral issue, which is slavery. Like, how can we justify enslaving beings that are essentially human? And he even brings Scott Bokatman, another scholar, who argues that the human-android division in the film is really just a way to show the difference between being human and acting humanely.
Right, so it's not about what you are, but about how you act.
Exactly. And his second point is that the big problem the film explores is humanity's own moral and spiritual decay. Like, the world of Blade Runner is a pretty messed up place, right?
Yeah, for sure.
So the question becomes, can we even be saved from ourselves? Like, is redemption even possible?
Okay, and the third point, this is where it gets really interesting, right? This is where the religious aspect comes in.
Right. So MacArthur argues that the ending of the film, those final scenes, they're essentially a reimagining of Jesus' crucifixion. And Roy Batty, the leader of the replicants, he's like a Christ figure.
Wow. Okay.
And his act of forgiving Deckard, that's like a glimmer of hope for humanity's redemption.
Okay, I'm hooked. I'm going to need you to break this down for me. So you said those penultimate and final scenes, those are key to this interpretation. What specific moments are we looking at here?
Okay, so focus on Batty's death scene, right?
Yeah.
And then that last scene where Deckard and Rachel escape together. In Batty's death, MacArthur points out all these little details that seem to point to Batty being like a Christ figure.
Okay, give me some examples. Like, what kind of details are we talking about?
Well, for example, there's that moment when Batty drives a nail through his own hand.
Oh, right.
It's a pretty graphic scene. And MacArthur argues that this is a direct reference to the crucifixion.
Yeah, I can see that.
Then, right after that, as Batty's dying, a white dove appears out of nowhere and flies away. It's the only real animal, like natural animal, that we see in the whole film, right? And of course, the white dove is a classic Christian symbol, right? It represents the Holy Spirit, peace, forgiveness, all that.
Yeah, that dove always stuck with me. But I never made that connection, that religious connection.
And then there's the big neon T behind Batty during his whole Tears and Rain speech. That T, it's shaped like a cross, like literally a cross. So MacArthur's saying, that's another visual clue.
Wow, okay. So if we take these religious associations seriously, how does that change how we see the whole story? Like, what kind of questions does it raise?
Right, so if Batty is a Christ figure, then was he wrongly accused? Is he a savior and not a criminal? And the big one are the humans, the ones hunting him. Are they actually the bad guys here? The ones who need saving.
Yeah, that definitely flips the script a bit. So what evidence does MacArthur present to support this whole idea of humanity being morally bankrupt in the film? Like, what are the signs?
Well, he points to the fact that the whole world of Blade Runner is built on slavery.
Right.
Humans are literally creating these intelligent, sentient beings and then using them as slaves.
Right. The replicants are basically doing all the dirty work, all the dangerous jobs.
Exactly. And they're treated as property. And MacArthur points out that Tyrell's motto, more human than human, is our motto. It becomes super ironic when you think about how they're treating the replicant.
Oh yeah, totally. It's like you're saying they're more human than human, but you're treating them like machines, like objects.
Right. And he compares it to historical examples of slavery, where slave owners would dehumanize the people they enslaved to justify their actions.
Okay, so if the humans are morally corrupt, then the replicants must be seen as human in a real way, right?
Exactly.
Right.
And MacArthur, he challenges this whole idea that humanity is just about biology. He brings in the work of Ludwig Wittgenstein, a philosopher who was all about how we use language. And Wittgenstein said that being human is more about behavior, like how we act, our capacity for thought and feeling, all that.
Right, not just where we come from or who created us.
Exactly. And he also mentions Barry's Gout, another philosopher who talks about two different senses of human. There's the biological sense, which is all about genetics and stuff, and then there's the evaluative sense, which is about the qualities we value in humans. Things like kindness, empathy, all that.
Okay, so MacArthur's saying that even if replicants aren't human in the biological sense, they definitely are in the evaluative sense.
Right. And he even argues that in the film, it's often the humans who are acting inhumanely, while the replicants are showing these really human qualities.
Okay, but what about all the arguments against replicants being human? Like people say, well, they're artificially created, they have false memories implanted, they have a short lifespan. How does MacArthur address that?
So he tackles those arguments head on. He says, look, we already use technology to create humans, like with IVF, and we don't say those babies aren't human. And as for false memories, well, human memory is super unreliable anyway, right? We all have false memories, we just don't know it. And about the lifespan thing, well, human lifespans vary all over the place anyway. So he says, focusing on those differences, it's just a way to avoid the obvious, which is that replicants are essentially human in every way that matters.
Okay, that's a pretty compelling argument. Let's talk about the Voight-Kampff test again for a second. If it doesn't actually measure empathy, what does MacArthur think it's picking up on?
Well, he suggests that maybe it's just measuring emotional responses, not actual empathy. Like maybe those replicants are reacting to those disturbing questions because they're nostalgic for a natural world they never even knew. Like they
Yeah.
see those images of animals and it triggers some kind of like primal longing, even though they've never actually experienced nature firsthand.
Huh. That's an interesting thought. And it kind of makes you think about the machine itself, too. Like, this mechanical thing is supposed to detect something as complex as empathy.
Right. Like how can a machine possibly understand what it means to feel another being's emotions? MacArthur thinks it's pretty ironic. He says it raises the question of whether a machine can ever truly understand what it means to be human.
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit and talk about the world the humans are living in. Like, how does the setting contribute to this idea of moral blindness?
So MacArthur paints this really bleak picture of the environment. It's post-apocalyptic, polluted, there's barely any nature left. And he says that the humans who are left, like Deckard, Gaff, Bryant, they all seem kind of emotionally detached. Like even their relationships with each other feel empty and superficial. He even mentions Tyrell's coldness towards Rachel, even though she's based on his own niece.
Yeah, that's true. It's like they've lost the ability to connect with each other on a meaningful level.
Right. And that's a huge contrast to the replicants. Like, the strongest displays of empathy we see in the film are actually between the replicants.
Yeah, like when Leon freaks out after Zora is killed.
Exactly. Or when Roy mourns for Pris. MacArthur even points out that Roy shows more self-awareness than Deckard. Like, Roy actually reflects on his actions. He says, I've done questionable things. But Deckard, his response to killing is just to drink. He doesn't seem to grapple with it emotionally at all.
Okay, so with all this in mind, MacArthur argues that this whole question, is Deckard a replicant? It's kind of a distraction.
Right. He calls it a red herring. He says that fixating on Deckard's identity misses the point. The real question, he says, is whether anyone in this world, human or replicant, still has any humanity left.
Okay, so it's not about who's human and who's not. It's about whether anyone is acting humanely.
Exactly. And he interprets Ray's line, come on, Deckard, show me what you're made of, not as a question about his biology, but about his moral character.
Okay, that's a cool interpretation. What about that origami unicorn? You know, the one Gaff leaves for Deckard. Most people see that as proof that Deckard's a replicant. What does MacArthur say about that?
Well, he pushes back against that pretty hard. He says a unicorn is a mythical creature, right? So if Deckard is a replicant with implanted memories, how could he have a memory of a unicorn?
Hmm. That's a good point.
And he also says if those implanted memories are supposed to feel real, then why would they plant something so fantastical? He thinks it's more likely that Deckard's just dreaming about the unicorn.
Okay, so if the unicorn isn't proof that Deckard is a replicant, what does it symbolize? Like, what's MacArthur's take on that?
He sees it as another biblical reference, actually. Like, he thinks it's connected to the white dove that appears when Roy dies. It's all part of this religious subtext he sees running through the film.
Okay, let's get back to Roy as a Christ figure. MacArthur mentions that scene where Roy misquotes William Blake's poem, America. How does that fit into his interpretation?
So Roy says, "Fiery the angels fell," which is a slight misquote of the actual line from the poem. But MacArthur focuses on the figure of Orc in Blake's work. Orc is kind of like a rebellious revolutionary figure who's fighting against oppression. And MacArthur says that by identifying with Orc, Roy's positioning himself as a rebel against a corrupt system, just like the American revolutionaries were. And the irony is, of course, that America was built on slavery.
Right, and then you've got those off-world colony ads promising people a new life, which sounds pretty ironic when you think about how the replicants are treated.
Exactly. The promise of a better life is built on the backs of slaves. MacArthur sees that as another example of humanity's moral hypocrisy.
Okay, and then Tyrell calls Roy his prodigal son. What's the significance of that line?
So MacArthur says that line shows how Tyrell sees himself, like as this godlike creator figure, and even points out that the Tyrell Corporation building looks like a ziggurat, like those ancient Mesopotamian temples. So it's like Roy is returning to his creator, but it's also like he's being sacrificed.
Whoa, that's deep. And MacArthur even brings in the Book of Revelations.
Yeah, he sees a lot of parallels between the imagery in the film and the descriptions of the second coming of Christ in Revelations, like Christ riding a white horse, having eyes like fire, leading an army of angels. MacArthur thinks these connections might be intentional on the part of the filmmakers.
Okay, so there are a lot of biblical references here.
Yeah, definitely.
What about that recurring motif of eyes? Like, there's a lot of focus on eyes throughout the film. How does that connect to this whole moral blindness thing?
So MacArthur says that eyes, both literally and symbolically, represent how blind humanity is to the suffering of the replicants.
Like when Roy puts out Tyrell's eyes.
Exactly. He's literally blinding the creator. And MacArthur also points out the rhyme between I and I, suggesting that the replicants have a sense of self that the humans refuse to acknowledge. And then there's Pris, when she says that famous Descartes line, "I think, Sebastian, therefore I am."
Right, but it's ironic because the humans don't see her as a thinking being at all.
Exactly. And then the Nexus 6 replicants, they have all these superhuman abilities, right? Like they're stronger, faster, smarter than humans in many ways. But the humans are still blind to their humanity. MacArthur even compares Roy to Nietzsche's Superman, the Übermensch.
Yeah, he's like this powerful, tragic figure.
Exactly.
Okay, so with all of that focus on Roy, how does MacArthur explain that ending? The ending where Deckard and Rachel run away together, it feels kind of abrupt, anticlimactic even, after everything that's happened.
So MacArthur acknowledges that the ending can feel a bit jarring. But he says that if we see Batty as this Christ figure, this Übermensch, then the focus of the film shifts away from Deckard and onto Batty's sacrifice.
Okay, so Deckard's journey isn't actually the main point.
Right.
So what's Deckard's role then in those final moments?
MacArthur says Batty's death is for humanity, but not in a traditional religious sense. He's like a flawed savior, sacrificing himself for a species that doesn't even recognize his humanity. And Deckard, he represents fallen humanity. Remember what Batty says to him? "I've seen things you people wouldn't believe." Like, he's not even talking to Deckard as an individual anymore. He's talking to humanity as a whole.
Whoa. Yeah, that's powerful.
And then, why does Batty save Deckard? MacArthur says it's an act of forgiveness, of empathy. Like, even though Deckard has been hunting him, Batty shows him mercy.
Wow.
But more importantly, he forces Deckard to witness his death, to see, really see, the life and the death of a replicant.
So those long shots of Deckard watching Roy die in the rain, they're not just there for dramatic effect.
Right. MacArthur says they're about Deckard finally acknowledging Roy's existence, his humanity. It's like he's finally seeing what's been right in front of him the whole time.
Okay, so that brings us to Batty's final speech. Tears in rain. It's such a beautiful, haunting moment. What does MacArthur make of those lines?
Okay, so I've seen things you people wouldn't believe. MacArthur says that's not just about the things Batty has literally seen, but about the fact that replicants see and feel things that humans can't even comprehend. And time to die. That's a reminder that replicants are living under a death sentence, which makes them appreciate life even more. And MacArthur suggests that, in the end, Batty transcends death through his act of forgiveness. He becomes a symbol of hope for a better future, and Deckard is the only one who sees it.
And Deckard's reaction, he just says, finished. It's kind of a weird reaction.
Yeah, and MacArthur is critical of that. He questions whether Deckard has actually learned anything, whether he understands the significance of what he's just witnessed.
He's not exactly a changed man, is he?
Not really.
So MacArthur isn't a big fan of interpretations that focus on Deckard, then?
No, he thinks they missed the mark. He specifically criticizes that whole idea of turning the question of Deckard's identity back onto the viewer, like, are you a replicant? He thinks that's a cop-out. It's a way to avoid the real moral questions the film is raising.
Okay, so if the film isn't about Deckard, what is it about? What's the real point, according to MacArthur?
So here's the big takeaway. MacArthur says that the whole point of Blade Runner is to make us, the audience, witness Batty's transformation. When Batty says, I've seen things you people wouldn't believe, he's not just talking to the characters in the film, he's talking to us, the viewers. He's saying, you're blind to the suffering of others. You're blind to the humanity of those you see as different.
So it's like a mirror being held up to us.
Exactly. And our obsession with defining what makes someone human, that's part of the problem. MacArthur says it's a form of moral blindness. We're so focused on categories and labels that we fail to see the individual, the person, right in front of us.
Wow, that's heavy.
Yeah.
Okay, so to sum it all up, MacArthur is arguing that Blade Runner isn't about asking what is human, but about confronting our own potential for moral blindness.
Exactly. It's about recognizing the humanity of those we might be tempted to dehumanize.
It makes you think, doesn't it? So, as we wrap up this deep dive, what's one last thought you'd like to leave our listeners with?
Well, I'd just ask everyone to consider how this interpretation might apply to the real world, to our own lives. Like, are we guilty of moral blindness? Are we failing to see the humanity of those who are different from us? Are we so caught up in labels and categories that we're missing the individual? It's something to think about.
It definitely is. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Thanks for having me.